Sabah al khair. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of the day on Nakba memory. My name is Anahid Al-Hardan. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, and I'm on the advisory board of this archive. I'm very happy today to be introducing and chairing the first panel with 4 speakers, actually. One of them is going to present via video link up. She couldn't come, which means there's a slight change to the program. We're going to begin with May Say Ali, who is an associate professor of history at Wayne State University in the Department of Classical Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. She was there until September 2018. She has been an editor of various journals. Her work has focused on the social history of Arab societies, specifically Palestinians, and to a lesser degree on the Arabian Gulf societies. Her most current publication is Silent Revolution, the Arab Spring, and the Gulf States. So the second speaker is to my left, Muhtasib, who is a professor of media studies and the director of the Center for Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at California State University in San Bernardino. Her research interests include digital communication, social media, and diasporic communities. And she is just recently directed an award-winning documentary called 1948, Creation and Catastrophe, followed by our third speaker today, Sophie Richter Devro, who is an associate professor in the Women's Society and Development Program in Middle East Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar, and an honorary fellow at the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter in the UK. Among her research interests are everyday politics and women's activism in the Middle East. Her most recent publication is Women's Political Activism in Palestine, Peace Building, Resistance, and Survival. And finally, our fourth speaker, who we're going to have via video link up, is Malak Shweikh, who teaches Arab, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Leeds, and whose research addresses prison dynamics, hunger strikes. She wrote the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, so I have to read it, although I don't subscribe to that term, and oral history projects in occupied Palestine. So I've been given instructions to be a bit of a dictator with timekeeping, so I'm going to have to apologize to the panelists in advance, but we have 15 minutes going up to a maximum of 17, if we can, please, so we can give enough time for everyone to talk and a good Q&A. So we will begin with May.
You have on the program who I am, and you don't need to know more. The topic, my choice, is the insider-outsider among researchers, particularly social history and oral history researchers. Who is the insider and who is the outsider, and how can you define it? It's a topic, my choice, is to tackle an academic and ethical dilemma of all of us, those of us who are researching, have researched, or do always ask, where do I stand in that? In oral history in particular, this is very fundamental. And Palestinian history is even more specifically important to know where you are and the specificity of what you do and why you are doing it. The analysis explains to you after you do your work. The analysis tells you how fair and unfair were you and how biased or unbiased, okay? The field of oral history, with its intrinsic humanistic nature, the voice, the emotion, the experience, and the memory, is colored by the many hues of human experience and its qualities. In this paper, I will be using my personal career and research and experience to tell you how I came about to be so analytical of the roles that we take. As a social historian, which I am, my affinity with oral history, especially its ethical requirements, led me to find its methodologies and people-friendly ways the path to answer my search as a Palestinian for authentic grassroots verification and justification of historical facts, and to pinpoint justice, injustice in the historical records of vulnerable and manipulated communities, Palestinians in particular. Similar to the first generation of the Nakba, myself, living the tumultuous upheavals and uprooting of 1948, I was in search of explanations and the truthful rendition of our story. Investigating through oral history, I centered on the roles of the interviewer-interviewee communication, roles that should be subject to analysis and transparency. I mostly adopted the role of interviewer, sometimes interviewee, as well as that of teacher, because I taught oral history for over 12 years at the university level. Over the last 50 years of academic achievements, I settled on oral history methodologies to collecting Palestinian oral testimonies. In it, I found a marvelous medium to bring forth the humanist soul of the Palestinian story by highlighting the voice, the anguish, and the drama of its people and carriers of its authenticity and legacy. This was a position from within and from without the target community. I mean, being a Palestinian and also a trained researcher of Palestinian history, in this way, I lived the paradox of both sides. These practices gave me opportunity to review and seriously analyze the two roles and their impact on my own investigation and analysis. As if you go to the literature, as many have written on this issue of the inside-outsiders in oral history, you look at David Bridges, the DCU ethics regulations, and so on, all. And further on, I'll try to cut up because we need the time. Please, you can ask me for anything, particularly how I did use that in my teaching, because methodology is very important. I will illustrate by taking certain examples from my research as well as my investigation and collections of oral history. I'm bringing out three main highlights in my own work. The first was the challenge to historicity, to the historicity of the Palestinian story. In fact, while researching Palestinian socioeconomic history through the archives in the West and in Israel, as well as the fewer records in the Arab world, there was very clearly, I found, subversion of the Arab-Palestinian narrative. Other difficulties were exclusion of the insider researcher, exclusion from access to archives. This I experienced while doing my research, particularly in Israel. The Israel State Archives were definitely, I was marginalized. Often records were not given to me, and I had to ask my Jewish friends who were in the archives with me to get the files that I needed. And I am talking about the early 70s. This is when I started my research. But this association also, when I tried to interview Israeli politicians who were active during that period, my attempts were trivialized. Why do you want to? Who are you? And so on. So basically, by collecting the basic research for my thesis, which was in the early 1940s and 1970s, this is the kind of reaction I got. Therefore, my association with archives and archival documents helped sharpen the sense of critical assessment and sensitivity to what lies beyond and above the records. This I did, as I told you, in the Israel and Zionist State Archives, as well as interviewing people. The second highlight I faced is when I wanted to study Haifa, which is the subject of my PhD thesis, and it's a book now, both in Arabic and English. There, I wanted to draw the map, this physical map of the city of Haifa from its early beginnings. I could not find any archival material anywhere, whether in the municipal, in the state, very slanted few archives in the Zionist archives, but nothing that I could. So I sought to really get the layout of the city. My only option in 1973, that's 45 years ago, I'm old, was to enlist the help of surviving old residents, ages between 65 and 80, of the city who had known it since First World War, and that was the period I wished. That started an interesting period of my education, where I roamed the city, the old city of Haifa, going up its old steps. Anybody who knows Haifa will know what I'm talking about. The old steps of Haifa, all the quarters with the eyes and the memory, corrective memory of these old men. I became to be known that Seikali woman with the old men going around the city. But these old men kept me on my toes with their questions of my knowledge, my purpose, although I was accepted as an insider, having been introduced by relatives of mine. I'm originally from Haifa, and by trusted local intermediaries, but they were suspicious. Don't forget, we're talking 1945, 1973. That is a very small period since the Arabs of the inside were permitted to go around. So I had to take the context, I had to understand why and how they are, I had to analyze everything coming there. But they helped me recognize my limitations and the role as oral transmitters of facts, unavailable otherwise. That encounter made me aware of my dual role as an insider-outsider, both ways, and its parameters by stressing the demands, the expectations, and the responsibilities that come with the pull of these two roles that I was having. Are we disturbing him?
He's doing very well.
It was an important lesson to properly define where the researcher stood within Palestinian realities of time, framed by both my encounter and the antagonistic experience I had with the Israel State Archives. In fact, when I first wanted, even though I had letters from Moshe Maoz and various people who knew my advisors, they told me, why do you expect? Who told you? A goyim, we're going to let you, an un-Jew, we're going to let you into the archives. They had to at the end, but they circumvented it by not giving me the documents. Another arena of these challenges that I faced was in the interviews. While building my collection, while building my collection of interviews, which I started in a very serious, very oral history regulation standard format by 1990. Previously, everything I told you was prior to that period where I took notes like many of the speakers yesterday told us. Initially, we took notes. I came into oral history by trying it, by living it, by using it. And here, I began to collect in earnest, whereby I began particularly in specific periods like Jerusalem. I did a lot of work, 1997-2000, to gauge the policy of expulsion, ethnic cleansing of the Jerusalemites of the inner city. Later on, I did studies on Galilee villages, the destroyed villages in the north, and as well as the villages destroyed around Jerusalem. Very gratifying work and very painful work. But for quite a few years, I was able to get off on sabbaticals and so on and do this sort of work. Otherwise, I was working for a living So I wouldn't say I was doing this on a continuous basis. The respondents that I used all over came from everywhere. Wherever I quote Palestinians, I introduced myself as an oral historian. I would like to interview you, and the older, the better. So my respondents were in the West. Many of them were around the villages that I studied, and in the camps of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and, as I said, everywhere. In fact, I would say that challenges that I faced were mostly whether the researcher would be given access and acceptance. This was the main issue that I had to contend with. I was accepted because on the fact that I immediately spoke the language, I had affinity, and I spoke to the people on that. As the interpreter of both the obvious and undercurrent messages in these interviews, my overlapping dual role as a community sympathizer and researcher is defined and clarified outcome. It helped, I would say. I was recognized and accepted, but also identifying with the participants and their stories carried its own pitfalls, which sometimes surfaced in the course of the communications, implying deep-rooted doubts and a legacy of disrupted dreams. These troubling challenges occurred only during heightened periods of political difficulties. And basically, it was mostly what I faced were implied and mostly muted challenges, and in essence, an outcry against the destiny that has created the Palestinian tragedy and its details. In practice, taking the form of an outcry against the role, authority, and affinity assumed by the researcher. In other words, even though these incidents were few, they were challenges to the right of an outsider that they looked at me at some point, presuming the job of the spokesperson and the recorder of the misfortune of Palestinians. That happened in camps, rather than it being someone from within the community itself. This is where I will illustrate one incident that comes out as very significant in my experience. This happened in the early 1990s, and this took place in a refugee camp in Jordan, where the residents of that camp had endured a lot. They had a history of multiple displacements, and in the process had experienced breakups of village groupings and family separations. Adding to that, the intermediary that I used was not efficient and didn't know well the community. So that was a handicap for me. While I was talking to a group of women, trying to explain the process and why and the purpose, there came a screaming man in the camp shouting against, accusing me of propagating crusading Western colonial policies. My outlook is very Western. So if I had a veil, if I knew how to comport myself in the proper method, knowing the conservatism of the setting I was in, I might not have faced that. But it was a frustrated Palestinian who had had it. He broke out, and we had to calm him, reintroduce my authenticity, my identity, but that gave me a lot to think about, because what was hidden in these interviews is much more than what came out. What came out is only the tip of the iceberg. But in fact, there is this kind of worry, anxiety. Who are you? What will you use it for? This started early on when these old Palestinians in Haifa were asking me, what for? Why? Why do you want to do a PhD? For what? As the Israeli David HaKohen, who was very important for my research, told me, why? I mean, I was young and pretty then. Why a young woman like you? Why a young woman like you wants to do this sort of thing? This is painful, but there is a purpose. It's not enough to listen to that. It's very significant to understand what's behind it. That's the purpose of the oral historian. That's the purpose of our analytical job. That's what we do after we interview, after we do the whole job, after we take their approvals and do the whole job. We have to synthesize. We have to explain. That's why, in conclusion, I'd like to say that I have to close it. I have 5 minutes or less. I did face challenges at all steps, but they were very significant in teaching me what to be, how to be, and that's why I use this in my curriculum of teaching. I have a course set up with syllabus, and in the curriculum of the course, I teach this issue of insider, outsider. How do you define yourself as the interpreter of the ideas you are given? These are jewels that people give you. It's the heart of their experience. It's their memory. And you have to be very cognizant of your responsibility and how you deal with it, how you use it, and how you circulate it. And I would close at this stage, and if you need any questions, I'm ready.
So thank you very much, and thank you very much also for sticking to the time. And over to our next speaker, Dan.
I'm just gonna put my PowerPoint. Assalamu alaikum. Sabah al khair. I apologize, I'm super jet lagged, so I will do my best to make sense. Okay, this paper is a kind of think out loud narrative of my journey from a junior scholar about 16 years ago, struggling with ontological, epistemological, and axiological questions also, learning, maturing, and still growing. I hope we all engage in a dialogue about these tough questions at the end of my presentation, as I don't really claim to have authority over the answers. It was in 2001 when I first read the great ethnographer Dwight Conkergood's article, Health Theater in a Hmong Refugee Camp, Performance, Communication, and Culture, about his 3-year critical ethnography in the Ban Vinai Hmong Refugee Camp in Thailand, not knowing that this study would have the most profound impact on my scholarly journey, especially that he also did some field work in Palestinian refugee camps in Gaza. Actually, he worked in Jabalia. Let me see if I could control this. Yeah, that's what. So I decided early on that this was the kind of study I would like to pursue, but in the Palestinian Nakba context. So I wrote to Dwight Conkergood before his death in 2004. He responded to me immediately, which was fascinating for me at that time. He said, my Palestinian fieldwork was disseminated through political activist networks instead of academic publications. He added, now you are the person with your background and linguistic skills to make the academic interventions. I was hampered from this by my lack of Arabic language skills. I'm gonna, we have some, intersectional, points that I will make about the insider, the outsider. So yeah, I made that assumption, while that encouraged me to start conceptualizing my study that has been evolving to a never-ending project. It made me think naively that there was little to do on my part in terms of getting access to my study and to the site and to the population. I thought that being a Palestinian product of the first Intifada who got shot at the age of 16 with a native Arabic tongue, was the daughter of a Palestinian political prisoner, meant that I was an insider. Especially I'm also visibly Muslim with my hijab. To the Palestinian refugees in their camps, where I choose to do my ethnographic work. Obviously, I was wrong. So even with hijab, actually, I have to disagree on that point. It's not necessarily going to mean that they are going to recognize you as an insider. I went ahead and started charting my site selection. The first praxeological question was how to choose the study site. This was one of the easiest questions to answer since I wanted to adopt a social justice approach, which meant focusing on the most marginalized group of the study population. So I studied the material conditions of each country, where Palestinian refugee camps were, and where I would conduct the study, and concluded that the ones in Lebanon at that time, of course, suffered the worst living conditions and institutional, structural repressive practices by the Lebanese government and some segments in society. Now, the most eye-opening part of Conger Good's article was his reflection on how Western aid workers view and judge the camp and the refugees in his study of the Hmong refugees, describing them in many agency reports as the filthiest, most primitive, and difficult in Thailand. Conger Good then deconstructs this essentializing from a Western perspective and how it is ontologically problematic. He provides an alternative view of the camp and refugees' health and sanitation issues after living with them, actually sharing a corner in a hut with 7 chickens and a pig for 3 years. He says, and this is what you see on the screen, but I'm going to read it. Moreover, there is no running water or adequate sewage disposable in the camp. Water has to be carried long distances in buckets, balanced in shoulder yokes, or in 10-gallon cans strapped to the back, a job usually done by teenagers. Sewage disposal is also a chronic problem. There are not enough pit toilets for the camp population. The latrines are distributed unevenly throughout the camp and clustered together in long rows. Convenient if you happen to live in a cluster, but the trade-off is the overwhelming stench. Because there is a shortage of toilets, they are kept locked and families have to obtain keys from the camp administration. Keys get lost, and there are never enough keys to go around, particularly for all the children. Further, you need to bring along a bucket of water to flush the shallow pit, water that is scarce and has to be carried on the back of some family members. Obviously, there are many disincentives for using the pit toilets. The stench alone is often a deterrent, because gaining access to and using the pit toilets is a rather complex operation most small children, 1/4 of the population, simply cannot manage. This was a very profound description, because here he's using this oppositional description or oppositional narrative that makes us realize that we need to decolonize ethnographic research as a scholarly practice and as a text as well. The beginnings with decolonizing knowledge on Arab and Muslim issues, of course, started with Edward Said and his work on Orientalism that critiqued the colonial knowledge production that was based on the so-called pseudoscience and that was employed most of the time to serve the imperialist and colonial conquests in Arab lands and Muslim lands. But it expanded to actual decolonial knowledge production by indigenous scholars mainly. An important epistemological question here is, if you are not indigenous to the site of study, like Conger Good studying the Hmong refugees or the Chicago gangs, for example, can you produce knowledge that is rooted in indigenous epistemology and ontology? This is especially important when you take a social constructivist approach that considers social phenomena as fluid and dynamic and not static. For example, this is from my study actually, when I wanted to study 1948 and Nakba, but many participants insisted on talking about the siege of the camps or the Israeli invasion or being hungry in the camp or their current issues. Actually, Mahmoud Zidane talked a little bit about it yesterday, and Diana and others actually mentioned this. You want to do something and you're so focused, but the participants are not necessarily interested in that. This was raised yesterday, as I said, by several people, and you should let your participant lead the way to gain their trust and respect, and because they are really the narrator of history in this case. Now I have a compelling collection of interview materials on Sabra and Shatila massacre, the Amal siege, the disappeared, etc., which was not really the original objective of my project. This became crystal clear to me when I met Abu Jamal in Sabra. He is from Deir el-Asi, which is adjacent to Rumaysh in Lebanon. His Nakba story was overshadowed by his son's loss story in 1982. on the 4th day of the Sabra and Shatila massacre on actually September 18th, he saw his son being dragged and taken away from a line of civilians in a street by the stadium by militants. Abu Jamal never saw Jamal again since then. In the last shot of a surreal scene in which the son disappeared, he whispered something to his brother before disappearing. His last words were, "Those are not Israelis." Since 1982, Abu Jamal did not care about anything but knowing what happened to his son. This was the only time I broke down and stopped my work and had to come back, the following day and talk to him and just let Abu Jamal or listen to Abu Jamal's story on the violence of disappearance. In addition to the question of who is an indigenous or insider scholar, another important question is, to what extent would that person have to be embedded in a culture? Also, what kind of ethnography are we talking about? The imperialist positivistic approach to pure observation of a culture is replaced more currently in critical ethnography with participant, observant, and sometimes full participant in the form of autoethnography that employs studies participants as co-authors or co-creators of meaning instead of essentializing about other cultures from our world perspective. In another article on rethinking ethnography, Conquer concludes, for ethnography, the undermining of objectivist science came roughly at the same time as the collapse of colonialism. Since then, post-colonial critics have set about unmasking the imperialist underpinning of anthropology, the discipline with which ethnography has closely, but not exclusively, been associated. Ethnography was also closely associated with surveillance and reflects power relations or differentials in the knowledge production process. This leads me to conclude that epistemologically, or this led me actually to conclude that epistemologically the study had to be a long-term experiential and indigenous ethnography. As Nwambe Iyo said it clearly, there seems to be no other better way actually than associating fully with them, meaning the participants, meeting them in the villages, joining them in their daily chores, and sharing with them their lifestyles. The problem is that I thought of myself as the indigenous, equating that with an insider. Well, it was not really the case since I have never lived the life of a refugee. The minute I started straddling down Al Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria in 2006, for example, I was immediately profiled as a Palestinian American, as you indicated, and not as a Palestinian refugee, not even as a, like even Palestinian didn't mean that I was a refugee. That was different, right? Big difference, not only that, but also the immediate naive assumptions and judgments I started creating as a junior scholar again. For example, in one of my first straddles in the narrow alleys of Shatila camp, also in 2006, I noticed a woman laying down, and she was in her small apartment, the door was open, she was exposed, and the immediate thing that came to my mind was, like she didn't respect her privacy, or she didn't care about her privacy, which is, of course, a terrible assumption on my part. Especially after I spent some time in the camps, I realized the lack of oxygen, more than anything else. You have this vertical expansion in the camp because they can't build outside of the camp, and you still have the small alleys. I mean, literally, oxygen was lacking when you are walking down those alleys. That's like, after just spending few hours in the camps, I started realizing, what it means really to live in a refugee camp, not just to think about it as a Palestinian, or like romanticizing the idea of being refugee as a site of struggle and all of these things. You get hit with the reality of life there, the shortage in electricity and all the other issues, the sewage in the streets. So I started being very self-conscious about the crisis of representation as put by Marcus and Fisher, and how it has reduced or induced actually deep epistemological, methodological, and ethical self-questioning. Ethnography is an embodied practice. It is an intensely sensuous way of knowing. The embodied researcher is the instrument. I forgot to show the other picture. Ethnographic rigor, disciplinary authority, and professional reputation are established by the length of time, depth of commitment, and risks, bodily, physical, and emotional, taken in order to acquire cultural understanding. What this means is that in order to transcend the cultural difference, you need to employ your bodily as well as your intellectual experiential learning into making sense of the study site and social practices. For example, Konkon himself lived with not only the refugees, the Hmong refugees, but also the Chicago gang members. He was actually at risk of being killed several times. An epistemological question is who could do that? Attempting to achieve that integrative experience, I was eating whenever I offered food, drinking 10 or 20 cups of coffee, responding to invitations to participate in different social activities in the camp, just walking around the camp and talking to people, and also attempting to rent in Shatila, because I thought that was very important if I had to have that experiential learning experience. But I was faced with many limitations in terms of the lived experience, the duration of the study, lack of funding that made my dream ethnography impossible to achieve at that time. I wanted to go back, but this is when I had my first and only son also. Then I had to work, the work limitations, funding, etc. When I thought I would one day go back to Al Yarmouk to live, participate, and observe, because my husband's family was there, part of them at least, there was no longer a Yarmouk refugee camp afterwards. So like when I had, this could work actually, I could do it in Syria. Anyway, therefore I shifted my focus to both in-depth, semi-structured interviews and filmmaking. Although I had the privilege of the Palestinian heritage, the mother tongue of my participants, and strong connection to the culture and history of the refugee camps, I also reached out to participants from my current environment, which was discussed at length yesterday by amazing Rosemary Sayed. I saw her coming in today. To go beyond sometimes the camps. I did a lot of listening to interviewees and let them narrate even if they drifted away from my original study goal. Out of the listening to these marginalized voices came an early decision to make other people listen to those narratives as well. Hence the decision to make a short classroom resource on cognitive narratology, collective memory, and identity, which was the original focus of my study. Naturally, a critical scholar is an activist, an advocate, asking myself or herself the question, how could I give back to my community? Conquer Good critiques the lack of bodily experience in many of the published ethnographies that favored abstracted theory and analysis. One example I have is from 2003 ICA conference presentation. It was Israelis trying really to interpret how Palestinian youth interact with Israeli youth. It's a very interesting story. I could go over, I have to finish. But it shows, this kind of like, a hegemonic Western interpretation of the indigenous culture. I will skip that and talk about it later. But anyway, another example from my work of Burj al-Barajni. I'm sorry, I timed it for 17 minutes. So
we had 17 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. All right, this is going to be the last one. Burj al-Barajni refugee camp came from an interview I did with Ahmed Mohammed al-Khatib Abu Rahif, who was born in Amqa, Western Galilee in 1930. One important thing he carried in his memory is the peace and nature of Palestine that stands in stark contrast against the noise and crowdedness of the camp. His house in the camp was close to the highway compared to his house in Palestine, where he used to hear only the sounds and voices of nature and animals. Working for only 1 month in the refugee camp and experiencing at that time a tiny sliver of Abu Rahif's experience caused me migraines, which I eventually contributed to the noise pollution that I was not used to. I wouldn't have had the same appreciation of this nostalgic thought without experiencing the noise in the camps, even though it was nothing compared to his for 65 years. Abu Rahif died a few years ago in the middle of noise and crowdedness. I will stop with Abu Rahif. I just wanted not to let you, leave you like hanging and tell you that I actually did several studies and collected a lot of information and interviews, and I ended up releasing a film after 11 years on working the film. So I diverted in so many directions. I'm still being, evolve and learn, and I could go over this after, in the discussion. And, okay, thank you.
Thank you. So one thing I didn't mention is that there is microphones في ميكروفونات للترجمة الفورية للي بده يسمع المحاضرات باللغة العربية. Okay, so our next speaker is Sophie. Oh, hi. You're here.
Yes, you can stop me there.
I'll operate from here. Yeah? Okay. Well, I want to start by thanking the Poha team for inviting me. It's been very emotional day yesterday, and I've been very impressed by the work that you have done, so I want to really congratulate you for this fantastic archive, everybody who has worked on it, and I feel very fortunate to somehow be part of this launch. I'm very happy to be here. So in my presentation, I would like to reflect on some of the challenges that I faced when conducting an oral history project, or what was originally conceptualized as an oral history project with the Nakab Bedouin community in southern historic Palestine. As we've heard yesterday, women's oral histories, of course, challenge in a very important way colonial, nationalist, male-dominated, and other hegemonic narratives by recuperating the subaltern and marginalized voices of women. But as I faced during my project, there are also limitations and specific questions that oral history raises, and in particular, these questions concern the politics of representations and the modes and modalities of representations. So here in this talk, I would like to focus on specifically the question of scholarly authority. What does it mean when we as scholars, archivists, or oral historians fix women's embodied and oral narratives into a different format of representation, the text, the archive, the recorded? So to illustrate this point, I want to confront you with two different kinds of representations. This is the first. It comes from the so-called Museum of Bedouin Culture, which is located in the Israeli Jewish kibbutz of Lahav. I don't have to say very much about the image itself. I think it speaks for itself. Rather, I would like to contrast it with another form of representation or presentation. No, not this one. Wait. This one.
من غازي العريش وغد من غازي العريش وغد.
So this, what you heard, I hope you heard it, was a song sung by Bedouin women not far from the museum in the township of Rahat. So this is just a few kilometers away from this museum and the kind of frozen representations that we see here in the museum. So while the song, of course, is a lived tradition representing and presenting Nakab Bedouin, the first representation here of the museum freezes the community, its traditions behind these very sterile and sterile vitrine glasses of the museum. So there are, as we know, very clear pitfalls to such salvage approaches to anthropology and oral history or museum studies. As I think the image from the museum highlights, especially when contrasted to this lived, embodied, and sonic performance of the song, writing, recording, or archiving women's lives can in fact be an act of epistemic violence, freezing the lived experience in a distant and somewhat timeless past, a dead past, behind the glass windows of the museum here. Now, this problem, of course, specifically exists in Palestine, where the native population faces a very powerful settler colonial regime that not only tries to materially, ethnically cleanse them, but also epistemologically erase them through knowledge production and control over knowledge production. So I think, the whole point of the conference, we all agree that there is definitely a need to counter such representations, and that is what my project originally set out to do. Together with oral historians from the community, I wanted to write a gendered history from below based on the oral narratives of the Bedouin women. Now, this community of the Nakab Bedouin has, of course, faced various waves of displacement and dispossession, not only in 1948, but also during the military period when they were moved into the enclosure zone in the northern Nakab region, and then after, or in the late 60s, moved back from the enclosure zone into 7 state-planned townships, the biggest of which is Rahat. You see it here on the picture, and that's also where the song was recorded. So today, the Nakab Bedouin number around 200,000 or even more. They are citizens of Israel. And they are continuously, also today, as has become more known, I think, facing demolitions and displacements. Nevertheless, historical knowledge about this community is scarce, and that is in fact also true for Palestinian historiography. Very often the Nakab Bedouin are kind of the forgotten part of the Palestinian population. And there also exists no indigenous Nakab Bedouin archive. What has been collected from the community has been done mainly by Israeli anthropologists, government officials, military officials. So there is certainly a big need to capture this very rich history of that community. But how can one, when one wants to do a local community archive, for example, how can you avoid these pitfalls of salvage anthropology that I think are very strongly captured in this image of the museum? What does it mean when we transfer the oral and embodied into the recorded, the preserved, and the written? This is what I would like to reflect upon here. Firstly, before I go more into the problems, I want to, however, still spend a little bit more time and stress more why it is important to collect particularly women's narratives from this community. And so women, Nakab Bedouin women, as Palestinians, as Bedouin, are really among the most marginalized voices of the region. This is despite the fact that they have, of course, a lot to offer, and let me illustrate this by a song. Here's the translation of the song. I'm not going to read it out, but I think you can read through it while I continue talking. So the song tells a very important counter-narrative to Israeli historiography. It reminds very powerfully of the Israeli military assaults on the native population. It mentions in Arabic several names of the places in historical Palestine, and this shows clearly that this community therefore was connected to places all over Palestine, not just in the Nakab. People had very intimate relations and felt connected to the social and political space in Palestine, in Gaza, in Al Arish, in Khalil, etc. As such, songs like this or narratives like this contest also the Israeli divide and rule policies that try to somehow single out the Bedouin as distinctive or different from the rest of the Palestinian community. There is this tendency to divide Palestinian community between urban, peasant, and Bedou. But my narratives with Bedouin women showed that they have very close connections. They used to travel to Gaza for exchanges, etc., for trade. So it's very important to how they push back on the divide and rule. Also, much of the narratives tell about women and men working on the lands. The song that I played earlier spoke about how Atiyaha wazra'u al-ard min ghazal al-arish uqat. So it was speaking about how this Tiyaha tribe was farming on the land from Gaza to Al Arish and further. Therefore, very much confirming that these were not rootless nomads roaming about in the desert without any connections to the land, but rather showing very clearly that people knew which are their lands and where are the borders of their lands, etc. Okay, so what then happens when we collect these narratives, write them down, as I did here violently on the screen, and salvage them? Dennis Tedlock, the oral historian, has reflected on this very powerfully. He has he has reflected on it in the following way. He said, what happens when anthropologists publish huge quantities of myths, legends, stories from oral histories of Indian tribes where he worked, is that then when those people have those books and read them, they take that to be absolutely correct. Right there, it freezes their tradition. They daren't change it now because it's in print. That becomes a sort of authority, and in some way it's too bad because there are very subtle and good ways in which a culture can change itself and its image of itself, which you have ruined if you put down what was supposedly a fact at a certain date back there somewhere, or what was supposedly the correct version of the story. The problem he raises here is also very true for the Naka Bedouin. This was until recently an oral community where historical accounts were only rarely written down. The knowledges that are orally transmitted are flexible. As you have seen with the song, the end rhymes can always change. So you can change from Gaza to Al-Arish to Barka, etc. I also heard other songs where the end rhymes were changed according to different rulers, to the Ottomans and British and Israeli, and Dayan could be exchanged for another name, etc. So it's very important to consider this warning here from Dennis Tedlock that there exists a danger that we freeze the oral accounts when we archive or write them down, and also that there exists this assumed authority of the written, the fixed, over the oral or the embodied. Of course, the Israeli regime has spent great efforts in freezing and consequently taking control of Naka Bedouin history and traditions. That has showed, I think, that writing oral histories or archiving them is not necessarily in and of itself always a benevolent act that salvages or preserves these indigenous knowledges, but rather the transferal of the written, of the oral to the written, can mean an act of epistemic violence. It's not simply a question of technicality. It's not just a question that we can somehow try and represent in text where there are pauses or what timbre the voice had, etc. But rather, it really is a question of power, because writing and fixing lives means also establishing hierarchies, the written over the oral, the fixed and registered over the more flexible and elusive and ambiguous. It's also not simply a methodological question of whether we should work on text or whether we should work on oral narratives or embodied practices. Rather, it's really a profoundly political question, I think. Because in the context of an oral community such as the Naka Bedouin, archiving women's lives might mean might be an act of making this indigenous community legible and therefore also governable in and to a system of Western modernity, the text, which is largely inaccessible to them. So this was the dilemma I faced, that I found it a very violent act to somehow fix and freeze these more ambiguous and elusive and flexible oral narratives. I found somewhat an inspiration in the work of the performance studies scholar Diana Taylor, who also has critiqued the Western logocentrism, Western's obsession with the word, and instead proposes the repertoire, what she calls the repertoire, of embodied performances, songs, oral narratives, etc. And she says that we should consider these as historical practices. And these performances, of course, require presence, as she says here in the quote, which you can read. Requiring presence means it always depends on people being there. It's always a live performance where everybody participates. And that means that the knowledges are not simply preserved or maintained, but they are also transmitted and changed and adapted and lived in a lived way. So that raises the question, what would it mean to do a historiography of the Nakab by studying not the oral testimonies, but by studying gestures, performances, orality, recitals, song recitals, etc. what would it mean to study this repertoire, these repertoires of embodied sonic knowledges to gain insights also into the epistemes and ways of knowing and being in the world of that community. Don't really have a very good answer to that, so I want to conclude with the quote from a Rababa player who had recited very rich repertoire of oral traditions and stories to me. And when I asked him at the end of his performance what the meaning of the rababa is, not simply as an instrument, as an object, but the playing of the rababa. I had in mind Ted Lock's differentiation where he says, it's about singing, not the song, it's about the doing. Khaled answered in the following way. He said, if a human being has in his hands the rababa, he has qiyam, morals, gallantry, noble-mindedness, self-worth. This is what distinguishes us, and we must look after it. Not just look through photo albums and that's it. This life must be with us. I want this culture to live and to be built as well, and pass from generation to generation. It's something we're proud of. So to conclude, I think Khalid's word function as a very powerful reminder to us that as oral historians, archivists, anthropologists, we need to think very carefully about the modalities of how we preserve and represent. We need to remain alert to the fact that fixing narratives and practices in text might also mean fixing meanings of the past, and fixing meanings of the past means also setting frames and boundaries of how to imagine futures, I think. And as such, I find it very important to prioritize the community's own indigenous epistemes and ways of being in the world, which in their own and very immediate and actualized way, as you see here, indeed can challenge Western epistemic hierarchies, violence, and also colonial erasures in and of themselves, in their ways of being and acting. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. So now our final speaker, Meleke, who sent us a video, which we will watch and then have the opportunity to have a discussion.
Good morning. First of all, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak about a topic that is very close to my heart. I wanted to be with you today so badly, but it did not work out. And I hope that we get to meet, coordinate, and work together on issues related to oral history, Palestine, and beyond very soon. My story with oral history started when I was a little kid in the Gaza Strip, some 20 or 22 years ago. I used to sit with my granny for hours, and she used to tell me a lot of stories that happened with her back in the days. But one constant theme that used to come up a lot was the story about our homeland. I am of the generation born during the First Intifada. Most of my family are from the city of Jaffa. And I have a sharp recollection of stories that my grandma used to tell me about our homeland. The scene of the orange trees blowing in the wind. There was nothing quite as provoking as the image of the trees standing tall and free. And growing up as a refugee in the Gaza Strip, I burned these images into my mind. And I would always tell my granny that I wanted to go and see it. I wanted to touch it. I wanted to feel it. And she, like the resilience of these trees, reminded me to be strong and never submit to powerlessness, especially in the face of injustice. My grandma is still alive within us, within her children and grandchildren, like the memories of all our grandmas. These spark the interest, these memories spark the interest in projects related to oral history for me. they spark the interest in transmitting these narratives from the old to the young, who has never and will never forget where we originally came from. And this takes me nicely to the case study and the topic that I'm going to be speaking about today: the significance of intergenerational and trans-regional synergy in oral history projects in Palestine. I'm going to be speaking about 2 or 3 oral history projects that inspired me and my work in the field of oral history. And I want to talk about how these projects link generations and geographical locations in Palestine and even beyond. Now, the first project that I'm going to be talking about is the project of oral history at the Islamic University of Gaza, where I did my undergraduate degree. Now, as someone who I did not know what the rest of Palestine looks like. I still don't know. I've never been there. But one thing that my generation often talks about is that borders are created to separate and divide us from home, and they should not stop us from connecting more or less the dots through stories and narratives, wherever and whichever generations these are coming from. The narratives collected in the oral history projects that still continues until this day in Gaza helped me and so many others in my generation in materializing the image of land in mind. They strengthen our sense of belonging and identity as Palestinian who has never been and probably will never be able to enter Palestine while still under occupation. Now, working with is even clearer in projects such as that led by Tamer Institute for Community Education. I'm not sure how much you know about Tamer Institute for Community Education, but it's a fascinating project. And it started sometimes in 1998 in Jerusalem. And it works between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank mostly, but I do hope that they go beyond that and they focus their effort as well, even outside Palestine, and connecting the generations and beyond outside Palestine as well. Now, one of the things that I find really inspiring about this project is that they train the young generation to use oral history methods and collecting narratives and data, and even producing what they collect to the public in general and constant publications. And even more inspiring in this project is the Gaza Strip, which is vital and significant to the project itself. And I find the Gaza Strip a place that does not often appear in academic and non-academic narrative on Palestine. Now, when children work on places like Hayy al-Ajami neighborhood, where my family, most of them came from, that includes interviews conducted in Gaza and beyond with refugees scattered in camps and by children. And that revives the link between the young and the old on one hand, and with historical sites in Palestine on the other. And what is really interesting in all these projects is the gender dimension and the role of women in these projects and in passing on stories across generations. Something that I hope that is covered in today in the conference, or even yesterday, or for days to come. But one thing that we need to keep into consideration here is the limitation that projects in the Gaza Strip would have. And probably one of the first limitations that would come into mind is the limitation of freedom of movement. As someone who comes from the Gaza Strip, I don't take this very lightly now. I don't take it for granted. And one example that I want to mention here is by someone who has been leading on history projects, and he used more or less his privilege to travel around Palestine, but also connecting the younger generation and the older generation to the land. This project is called Kunna wa Mazilna, and it's translated as more or less "We were" and will still be, and it's led by Tariq Qishawi. As far as I know, he's from Jerusalem, and he has been doing great work in this sense. Now, the project in this sense has gone beyond Palestine borders, and it helps those outside Palestine connecting to their homeland. And we all probably have seen some pictures that have been taken by Tariq before. And probably one of these pictures that still in mind until today is the picture of 3 grannies by the first time since 1948. And there is another picture which is also stick in mind until today, which is the picture of Zaina, who is originally from Akka. Celebrate her wedding, or she decided to celebrate her wedding in her hometown, a visit for her for the first time ever, and connecting with people that she met in Akka. Some of those turn up to be friends with her dad. Some others turn to be neighbors with her dads, and even she located her family house. She has a video call with her dad, and they managed to locate their family house there. And I asked Tariq, it's thinking of it does not sound really easy, especially in terms of facilitation, getting people in and out, and all these other things. And I asked him how he does it, and he said that people watch his videos online and they get in touch through social media, Facebook or other outlets, and that, if emphasizing one thing, it would be the role that he played as a young person, using the privilege, more or less, of being able to travel around Palestine, but also it emphasized the effectiveness of using, or it emphasized how much social media can bring those generations together and break borders. Now, important to mention here that such project can be criticized for reason related to visiting Palestine while still under occupation, obviously, and the fact that those people will need to cross through an airport, an Israeli airport, or an Israeli checkpoint, and pay for visa fees, etc. It's not a topic that I can cover in this session, but I hope it's covered somewhere in the conference or even beyond. Now, just to keep that short and sweet, hopefully, the last thing that I want to say is that I'm not only glad but also honored to speak today and to see the Palestine Oral History project coming out, and I'm sure it will be a treasure not only for academics but for the general public in Palestine and beyond. And thank you to all those who have been part of it, and I hope that the work continue. I hope that I continue working with you for years to come, and thank you so much for all your efforts.
Okay, so we have 40 minutes for a discussion. And I'm going to, in the interest of ending at 11 o'clock exactly, I'm going to collect a couple of questions, be a dictator again, but actually be the ultimate dictator by stealing the podium as the moderator and chair, and maybe saying a few words before I open it up to the discussion. So I think the common theme that's running in these 3 papers that we heard this morning is not so much about Nakba and memory as the title of the panel, but more about the question of engaging in a counter-hegemonic knowledge production project like Palestinian oral history or collecting Palestinian memory narratives and so forth. And I say counter-hegemonic because Palestine is settler colonized and the Nakba narrative continues to be denied in terms of the global scale of things, right? Not in Beirut as such. Does not necessarily entail a counter-hegemonic product, if you like, is what I'm hearing, or necessarily a politically radical outcome, right? So we heard in the first paper, in terms of the very epistemologies that we're trained in as scholars, how we're trained to think in terms of insiders, outsiders, how that doesn't exactly work or is counterproductive, to Palestinians who go to the field as insiders, and yet who are trained in these epistemologies that fundamentally have colonial origins, because they assume that the subject of research, the scholarly authority, is a particular imperial subject constituted through 19th century Western science and so forth. And in relation to the second paper, this came out very strongly in terms of what does it mean to decolonize knowledge production on Palestine. Is claiming some kind of indigeneity or an indigenous subject position enough? What does it mean? What is indigeneity? How are we accepted in the field and not accepted, and so forth? These questions were opened up in very interesting ways. And finally, the question of scholarly authority and representation, which came out in the very final paper, is that, and I think, and the question of epistemic violence, right? Because scholars continue to be the ones who have the final authority on the final product that's produced. So I think these are important questions for us to consider as a community that's interested in the archive and that's launching this archive. So just because these narratives are out there, the mission is not done, as it were, right? How we approach it, what happens to these narratives once they enter the public domain and so forth, are really tricky epistemological questions and are questions that I think the three speakers invited us to think about and take very seriously. So I'm just opening this up for the discussion and for the speakers, and because we don't have that many time, maybe you guys can incorporate a response in your question, in your answers if you so wish. But I'm going to begin now by collecting the three questions. So I saw a woman, and please, can you please introduce who you are before you ask your question? And you can ask in Arabic. All our panelists speak Arabic or English. It's the same.
Hi, my name is Rihab Shraidi. I'll leave it there because the rest is always a long story, like probably many people in this room. My question is to Sophie. I found what you said very interesting about the way we fix, the problematics of fixing story, of narrative. However, I grew up in Australia, so I know all about the colonial story, from my experience of growing up in Australia. And I think all colonial powers have this process whereby they try and distort and erase the history of Indigenous people. It's important work within the colonial project of trying to justify, legitimise their existence there. That's not unique to Palestine. What is unique to Palestine, and this is where my question is, so specifically to the question of Palestine, what is unique here is the measures that have taken place that separate, that divide the Indigenous people from knowledge of their own history. So, for example, specifically the archives of our villages pre-48, the visual archive which was stolen in 1982, the libraries, personal and other collections that were stolen in 1948. I can go on and on about the knowledge that was stolen. So the denial of access to this, that is unique to Palestine. And so I guess the importance of recording these stories while we can, in 10 years from now, we can say there's not going to be anybody on this planet that was born in our villages that we were dispossessed from. That's a massive thing. And the fact that we are denied access to the knowledge about our histories. So with that in mind, the problematics that you raise, I think, are real. But with that in mind, I would just like you to elaborate on it with the specifics of Palestine.
Okay, so we'll take a second question, the gentleman in red, and please, I urge you to keep your questions short because we don't have that much time.
Yes, my name is Anis Masson. I'm a journalist, Palestinian refugee in Lebanon. I'll ask in Arabic, not in English, to express myself, to not misunderstand me. Okay. من خلال تجربتي ب 2018 عملت سلسلة دوكيومنتري وثائقية من 10 حلقات أخذت كتير تستومنز من شهادات من ناس كانوا بفلسطين. السؤال هو راح يكون كيف فينا نتعامل بالأرشيف أو نحن ك يعني مهتمين صحفيين أو باحثين أو بالشهادات السلبية. يعني بمعنى بالوقت اللي كان واحد من الشهادات من الناس من إصبع الجليل بقول لك كنا ننزل بعد النكبة، بعد ما اجوا على لبنان ينزلوا يسرقوا البيوت. كيف في اتعامل مع هيدي الحالة؟ وهي أكثر من حالة. الشغلة الثانية مثلا ناس بقلب فلسطين هن وجايين على لبنان، ناس فلسطينية كانوا يضطهدوهم أو يطردوهم من القرى اللي هن فيها، بعض القرى اللي بقيت. بس بنفس الوقت كان في ناس وهيدي شهادات يعني كان في ناس يخبوهم ويحاولوا هذا. كيف فينا نتعامل مع الشهادات السلبية هاي؟ وين فينا نحطها؟ هل to deny that يعني إنه ما نستخدمها، نحطها برات الأرشيف؟ Thank you.
Thank you. وكمان سؤال في هون.
Hi, Rana Sukkari, PhD candidate in sociology. My question is also related to the ethical dilemma, especially in the question of like insider, outsider. When I'm working on a subject that I'm totally embedded in, so maybe it's like seeking an advice. Do you go back to the community and share the results with them, your analysis? Have you done it? And what if they tell you that no, there are some information that we needed to be invisible, and then a lot, like, you always have this dilemma of what to reveal, what not to reveal. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so maybe because the first question for Sophie was specifically for Sophie, maybe we can begin with Sophie and you can answer the questions that you want to, and then we'll move along the table.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. So the point of my presentation was in no way to say that oral history in the Palestinian context is not important. This I really want to stress very much. I think it is very important. That's why I'm here. That's why I support the project. So it is, of course, it is one crucial act of speaking back to encountering this precise erasure and the specificities that you outlined of the denial to access, the looting of the archives, etc. Of course, it's very important, therefore, to build up that material. But, and this is where I tried to focus on, while it is important and it has to happen in the Naqab, it has to happen. There's nothing of a community archive. It is all those kinds of representations in the Museum of Bedouin Culture in the Israeli kibbutz, you know. So it has to happen, there's no question. But at the same time, if there was to be made a Naqab Bedouin archive in Rahat, it also faces similar epistemological questions. And I think that indeed the archive here, Poha, has found ways. I was very impressed yesterday when you talked, for example, about the decisions to maintain the orality. I mean, that is one way to not freeze, to make people actually engage with the voice, with the body, with somehow a more lived representation, even though it's still recorded, but somehow a more lived representation of these narratives. So the thing that interests me is precisely how can we keep this alive? How can we also widen our scholarly focus to, for example, take into account rituals and dance and song as historical practices, because these are stored in the body as well. They are not only in the word. So here was kind of my focus. I think this بجاوب بالإنجليزي ممكن؟ لأنه إذا لا I won't be clear. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking back in English. I think, I mean, I faced this issue a lot in my oral histories with the women in the Naqab Bedouin community, because they have very different kinds of histories being told by tribe, I mean, they are very contradictory narratives, and not all of the narratives would be considered by everyone as heroic forms of resistance. I mean, very often the Naka Bedouin are accused of having collaborated at certain points in history. So there are very contentious stories coming out, and I think I think two things are important. One, not to press this very rich history into one heroic nationalist one, because lives are more complex than that. And second, to allow people also to refuse to speak. I mean, that is very important. There is no indigenous community must reveal everything. They can refuse. This is a very legitimate standpoint, to just not speak. And I think it's Audra Simpson in Indigenous Studies who has made that point, that the indigenous communities must also be able to refuse. Not everything must be for public consumption. There is a very important point, as you stressed, but at the same time, there's also the right to refuse. And it's important to take that serious, I think.
Okay. I'd like to respond to the three possibilities. Is that definitely the archives that are now kept under the Israel, at least my experience, the Israel and Zionist state archives, have a purpose. It's politicized. And obviously, many things were closed up to certain people. And we have to find ways to circumvent, to go around it. In my experience, and that's a long time ago in the state archives, is that, I definitely was not told bluntly, because I came from Oxford and I came with certain testimonies of professors, so they let me in, but they didn't give me the stuff. And this is politics. I understood it. I had to find a ways, and there were other students with me coming at the same time whom I knew, who were Jewish or even Zionist, who were sympathizers, who said, this can't be done. So I would give them my request, and I got the material, but I knew I didn't get everything I wanted. It was clear, we have to understand that we are occupied, it's a project that is colonial, that is very clear. Now, very recently, they opened the archives for the very recent, 2 weeks ago, certain archives were opened. These are things, we got them out of testimonies. So that confirmed our testimonies, and we knew they were correct, our testimonials of what had happened. So basically feel that we are fighting a very serious battle with very serious enemies. And shahadat salbiye are part and parcel of the history. All through, when I was doing work on Haifa, I was told, don't go talk to so-and-so, he sold land, he was a collaborator. I did quite a lot within my research. I would advise you to read my book on Haifa, where basically it tells you basically how the first city of Palestine was Zionized. Between 1919 to 1939, the process was Zionization of the city. And many people did collaborate. They are human beings. Human beings do this and that, and they are part of our society. We don't like it, but this does not mean we have a rosy story. It's not. And they are part of the history, and we should keep them. Don't hide them. We should know our mistakes. This is what I was trying to say, is that by going to the issue of insider, outsider, I had to analyze myself. I had to analyze what did I do wrong, where, why, and how. So this is part of it. And on your request, what did you want advice on?
Like, when you are disseminating the knowledge, and you have this kind of, and you have this kind of something bad, something negative coming out. What do? Do you hide it, or
No.
do you
I just responded.
But during the analysis, do you go back to the community and just double check that?
Personally,
this is the
because I'm a teacher. Basically, I am a teacher of social history. I go back. I analyze myself. I analyze the process. After every interview, I try. It's difficult when you are doing them one after the other. But I go through every interview, I notate for myself, I put certain simple notes. And if there are necessities that are not clear, I go back to the community, to the people whom I interviewed. It's part and parcel of doing oral history in the classical, traditional way, is you interview and you ask the people. Of course, you take approval before, but then some people have a right, if they demand it, a right to look at your transcript or the tape, and I've done that often. I think you have similar.
بالنسبة للأستاذ محسن الشهادات السلبية، بعتقد إنه جزء من المشكلة إنه إحنا الفلسطينيين بنحط حالنا زي ما بنقول بالإنجليزي we put ourselves on a pedestal، وإنه يعني we romanticize شو فلسطيني، يعني آسفة رح أحكي بالإنجليزي والعربي قد ما بقدر، إنه إحنا بنفكر حالنا إنه ما في أخطاء، إحنا يعني كثير بنفكر إنه بسبب النكبة منعلي كثير من الصورة المثالية لإلنا، بس يعني هاي مشكلة عويصة لأنه إحنا ناس بشر، صح؟ At the end of the day يعني we have our like any other people our faults. We can't just overgeneralize to any single group of people. يعني في هيك وفي هيك. فمثلا من الشغلات اللي أنا وأنت بتعرف عن هاي الشغلة اللي أنا واجهتها، إنه استخدمت مثلا إنه في بعض في الفيلم مثلا المذابح اللي صارت من الفلسطينية ضد اليهود، بعض الأحيان يهود، يعني بنحكي إحنا civilians أو ناس عاديين إلى آخره. فهي عدد بسيط جدا، بس هل ممكن تحصل؟ مثلا ممكن تحصل، صح؟ فالواحد لازم يكون عنده مصداقية. الصورة الكبيرة هي المهمة، الصورة الكبيرة اللي هي التطهير العرقي مثلا، أو الطرد العرقي للفلسطينيين أو الجينوسايد إلى آخره، هذا التركيز عليها. بس هل بتكون موجود القصص اللي إحنا مش مفتخرين فيها كفلسطين؟ موجودة، بس لازم يكون عندنا مصداقية إن نحكي كل شيء ونقول إنه زي ما حكت الدكتورة مي، إنه هاي هي طبيعة البشر، بيخطئوا، بيصيروا عملاء، بيسووا مشاكل. في مثلا قصة لواحد من مخيم شتيلة قال إنه كان يشتغل محطة البترول في حيفا، معروفة كتير، مصفاية البترول، وزتوا اليهود لما اليهود عملوا تفجير قدام المحطة، بعدين الفلسطينيين انتقاما زتوا بعض العمال بالزفت المغلي، يعني هيك بيحكي هو بالرسالة. فجينا احنا بنحكي عن حادثة حيفا، وكان في أخذ وعطا نحطها ولا ما نحطها، خصوصا إنه عمل الفيلم معي هو واحد أمريكي، وبالنهاية قررنا ما نحطها بس لأنه ما في كان enough context عن القصة، لأنه ممكن تضر أكتر ما تفيد، ما رح، مش لأنه بدنا نخبي قصة سيئة. فيعني هي مش يعني it's not straightforward yes or no، يعني it's not a dichotomy, it's more complicated than that. بس بشكل عام لازم الإنسان يكون عنده مصداقية، لازم to acknowledge إنه الفلسطينية ناس طبعا بيخطئوا زي غيرهم، بالعكس يعني حد نحط تحت كل هالضغط هذا وكل هالأوبريشن هذا أكيد رح يطلع شغلات سيئة عادي جدا، وبالعكس أقل مما يتوقع من ناس مروا بهاي الظروف. بالنسبة لسؤال إنه going back to the site، طبعا المفروض الواحد يعني أنا حكيت عن قصة الإسرائيلية مثلا اللي عملت ريسيرش عن البيس كامبس، يعني she did research on peace camps بيعملوهم بإسرائيل بين الأولاد الفلسطينيين والأولاد الإسرائيليين، يعني كل كلام فاضي، ما بدي أحكي عن كل البروجكت نفسه، بس بدي أحكي عن الشغلة، عن الاناليسيس تاعتها how problematic it was. So one particular يعني coding problem إنه في طفل فلسطيني من غزة بيكتب إيميل لطفل إسرائيلي بيقول له sorry I haven't been in touch for a week because of the curfew. She coded that as blaming. And I was like, okay, يعني بالدiscussion قلت لها you don't know what you're talking about because that's his reality. It's a curfew. He doesn't have the privilege of having internet connection in his house. He has to go to an internet cafe. Like she didn't understand anything, but that also reflects the Israeli psyche of guilt. Right. And I felt like at the conscious level إنه that's guilt. هلا had this woman really was interested in understanding Palestinian narratives, understanding يعني the if she took that back to that child, maybe he could have told, I actually was not allowed to get out and I don't have internet connection to go to Akve. You know what I mean? So it's very important, especially for people who don't have the cultural and historical association with a specific community, to go back and ask those questions. Now, I'm still in the process. I haven't even published my book or written it, etc. I really drifted away from my research and did the film. But
Excellent film.
yeah, thank you, thank you, Habibti. But at the same time, I sent a fixer, a production assistant in 2015, and he collected. We still wanted to make sure that we document the approval of the participants and took to them the DVDs of the interviews, their interviews. And one of them, who had one of the most fascinating interview from Beit al-Masri, from Mar Ilyas, refused. He said, I don't give you permission. We had to respect it, and we took him out of the film. Yeah. Although this is someone who was casted when he left Akka, I think it was Akka, من راسه لرجلينه بالcast. And it was very important visual representation of a child being in cast, etc. And we cut it out, out of respect.
Yeah,
okay, so we have sorry, but we have time for another round of questions if we keep the questions short and the answers short, so we can be out of here at 11, I was told. So we have a question in the back. Okay, I see the hands. And then if there are more questions, I'm sure there's going to be a coffee break, there's the whole day. You can, approach the panelists and talk to them.
بس ما شيباني بدي أحكي عن هل يجب أن يتضمن Palestinian Oral History Archives شهادات من الجلادين مثلا من مجازر صبرا وشتيلة. في فيلم اسمه ماساكر عملته بيحكي عن الناس اللي قاموا بقتل الفلسطينيين في المخيمات. هل يجب أن يتضمن هذا الأرشيف هذه الشهادات؟ أو هل يمكن أن نبحث عن يهود يعني عجايز قاموا ببعض المجازر وهلأ تابوا؟ شكرا.
طيب في سؤال هون
مرحبا، أيها مسهلة مؤسسة الجنة. أنا بدي أسأل بخصوص اللاجئين الفلسطينيين لما سجل شهاداتهم. بطبيعة الحال اللاجئين الفلسطينيين تأثروا بالمجتمعات المضيفة، سواء بسوريا أو بلبنان أو حتى ابن يافا لما راح على غزة مثلا هو تأثر بثقافة غزة. صح مش بعيدة كثير، بس خلينا بلبنان، سوريا، الأردن. التأثر الثقافي قديش هو ممكن يأثر على الشهادة اللي ممكن تنحكى بعد 60 ولا 70 ولا 50 سنة. 2 على ذلك، هل تختلف الأسئلة بناء على دراسات معرفية بيوضعها الباحث اللي عم بيسجل هاي الشهادة؟ فهل ستختلف الأسئلة فيما لو كانت تسجيل في لبنان عن سوريا؟ شكرا.
اوكي، اظن الاسئله كانت للجميع. كمان سؤال اخير هون وبعدين نبلش بالاجوبه.
Actually, it wasn't really a question. I was just going to say I loved the image of the diorama of the Bedouin, and it reminded me of the experience of going to I don't know what they call it, the National Museum of the American Indian or something like this in Washington D.C., which is this on like a monumental scale. It's this kind of disembodied history without any mention of genocide, and this kind of very static idea of what Native American culture is and was.
And also in Hawaii, the Polynesian cultural music, it's just terrible.
There's 17 minutes left, so let's see how that goes. So who wants to begin with answering the questions, or were these comments? I think there were some questions.
There was a question.
There was a questions about the testimonies of the perpetrators and their place in the archives. The questions about the cultural influence of the particular location of the community being studied. And then, there were two questions actually. So who would like to begin?
I'll take the question in the back, just because this is part of my film, and I will let you answer the other questions. I don't claim to have the right answer. يعني أنا ما بحكي إني أنا عارفة بالضبط هيك أو هيك. كل واحد كل مجتهد النصيب مثل ما بنحكي بالعربي. So يعني I think in the film I did it, you haven't seen it, so it's gonna be very hard for you to imagine it. But since it was actually aimed at a Western, in particular U.S. Viewers or audience, we found it very crucial actually to include those testimonies. It wasn't though as part of an oral history project. That's different, I think. Probably I wouldn't have included that in the oral history project aspect of it. But in the movie, I thought it was very important that they talk about what they did. Now, there is a tricky part of your question because you said they had remorse, tabu, أو ندموا إلى آخره. In interviewing Israelis, and I didn't do those because I don't have access. أنا أصلاً من الضفة فلسطين. ممنوع أصلاً أفوت على مناطق إسرائيلية. I can't have access to those interviews, and I also, nobody's going to sit down from the Israelis and have an interview with me. But my American colleague, who was actually white American man, he was able to interview not all of them because we have a long list, and only few of them would talk about it. Most of them didn't want to even talk about it. We actually found out that there was a spectrum of Israelis. It's not just one point of view or perspective. There are a few who actually regretted what they did sincerely. Some of them couldn't live as Zionists and left Israel and lived in Europe. And there were, of course, on the very other end, those who, denied it totally. ما عملنا هيك, ما سوينا هيك. We didn't expel the Palestinians. They left on their own. They were scared. The Arab armies asked them to leave, etc. The official, Zionist narrative. And you have the ones in between who said something like, it was terrible, we did horrible things, but we had to do it because of the Holocaust, etc. There was a spectrum. I just wanted to say that there's a spectrum of opinions. It wasn't one versus the other. And at the end of the day, they all did not disagree on the facts on the ground. So this is the important thing. The facts on the ground among all three segments were basically the same. It was a systematic expulsion, whether they called it systematic ethnic expulsion or genocide or whatever they called it. At the end of the day, the facts were the same. And I thought this was very important to include in a film that was aimed at an American audience. Why? Because they are normalized to listening to the Israeli perspective. So you had to shatter that for them. You have to start where they are normalized, where they are comfortable listening to, and then you shatter it throughout the film. That was our approach. I mean, you might disagree with it. Now, in an oral history project, I probably wouldn't do that, but I'll let my colleagues also comment on this.
In fact, it has been done quite a lot. There are other documentaries where many of the generals, at the very beginning, when these things, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when such films began to come out, there were many generals who were ready, who had become very secure in the Israeli system, who began to talk out. And then there was a reversal. There was a closure. They began not to tell of their roles. So Jalladin, wherever, whether the inside or the outside, are there. But in the Israeli context, they were imbued with the idea that they have an ideal. They were creating something that, the Holocaust had caused, and so on. When I went to Haifa the first time after I finished my thesis, many tried to come and talk to me, to try and explain. I came as the coming back of the daughter of Haifa to my own city. And they wanted me to talk at the Hebrew University. Ilan Pape told me clear, don't go, because they want to normalize Dor Jalladin. This is one of the important factors that we as Palestinians, like they do themselves to their own cause, we have to take a stand. But oral history, many of these people are telling their stories, such as the story of Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin now has gotten a coverage of particularly those who contributed in it. And they are not very sorry. I mean, they tell you, we do that. Tantura is an incredible case of where they made people bury each other. You know, I mean, it's not only atrocities, it's horrible atrocities that were being committed. So we have our stories, and definitely they are part of our history. We don't bury it, but it's important that it is there for us to know.
Well, I don't have so much to add. I think I just wanted to take up your question. Yes, your question on the how the oral narratives of refugees might also be impacted by the host countries. I think, well, I think there's definitely influences, and that's very important, in fact, because I think that in order to understand the refugee experience, it's not about separating so much home and host, and that there's some kind of universal refugee experience to be captured, but it's always within the specific contexts of the host countries. So somehow this home-host division, I think, is of course there. There's the homeland, but at the same time, people have been for decades in the camps here in Lebanon, for example. So this is also part of their lived experiences. And this is through which the stories of the past are also told. And that's precisely, I think, when the notion of an embodied lived experiences as the basis for history telling becomes so important, because that's where we move away from that image of the glass vitrines of the museum, of like something frozen in the past. The past is told through the present and through the specific contexts that people navigate in the present. So for me, the very important and the very important point with this experience of going to the museum was that literally 5 minutes away from there, people were practicing their traditions and their histories. It was all there. But of course, the tourists are being dragged to the Museum of Bedouin Culture to learn that once upon a time there was something called the Bedouin, and they live just 5 minutes away, and they continue their traditions in this context of constant settler colonial erasure.
Thank you, Sophie. So I want you to join me in thanking the panelists for these very interesting papers and interventions, and to thank the audience as well. We're going to have a small coffee break where we can continue the conversation just in that room off the auditorium. Please be back here at 11:10 for the next panel on oral history, pedagogy, and culture. Thank you.